Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa, and today I'm going to be presenting my final research project on the long-term health exposure to radiation from uranium and the health risks. So, for those of you who don't know, uranium is symbolized by the letter U on the periodic table. It's a heavy and radioactive metal that is naturally occurring within the environment, and as it naturally decays, it emits a radioactive gas called radon. And it's most abundant within the southwest region of the United States, specifically within Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Uranium mining was a popular practice during the 1940s and the 1980s, and this was common on the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo Nation spans across the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And the uranium mining was popular because of the large supply and demand for nuclear weapons during wars between this time frame. So as time progressed, United States and tribal officials had implemented laws and restrictions regarding uranium mining taking place, and that in turn caused uranium mines to be immediately abandoned, and all these uranium mines were left unremediated. And to this day, the Navajo Nation accounts for over 500 abandoned uranium mines present. As you can see to the left in the map, there are a bunch of tiny little red dots, and each of those symbolize an abandoned uranium mine on the Navajo Nation. So during this time frame, it was common for members of the community to be employed by these mining companies to work directly with the uranium ore, and this mainly consisted of processing, mining, and collecting the uranium. However, a majority of these companies did not inform the workers and employees of associated health risks with the long-term exposure to the radioactive ore. So with that being said, there's been many concerns of chronic health conditions and the development of these conditions among miners, in addition to their offspring. So now that we have all the background information regarding my topic of interest, to reiterate it, we're focusing on the long-term exposure to radiation from previous uranium mining taking place in the Navajo Nation and associated health effects. And a few studies that I plan to discuss and go over are listed on the slide to the right. So this first study is called Uranium Mining and Lung Cancer Among Navajo Men in New Mexico and Arizona between 1969 and 1993. So this study was a population-based study focusing on Navajo men who were miners and who reside in New Mexico and Arizona between the time frame of 1969 and 1993. And this study had a goal of identifying possible relationships with the high rates of lung cancer and the practice of uranium mining. There was a study group that this study had, as well as a control group. Each group had data collected on them. This data collection included medical records that consisted of their type of cancer, whether that was lung or whether that was a different type of cancer, in addition to possible death records. On top of that, their occupation and exposure information was collected, and this was collected through uranium mining databases as well as historical information that was archived. So information and data was collected, and results had revealed that with the study group, 67% of individuals included in this study had lung cancer and occurred specifically within Navajo men who were minors at the time. One thing to note was that the findings in this study specifically focused on individuals who were non-smokers or had little smoking habits. So when comparing the results to the control group as well as Navajo men who were not minors, these individuals who were involved with mining had 20 to 30 times higher risk of developing lung cancer. In addition, they found that had an increased mortality rate during this time frame. And so the next two studies are sub-studies of the Navajo Birth Cohort Study, also called the NBCS. The NCBS was initiated in 2010 as an epidemiological study focusing on Navajo mothers and their children. This study has had a goal of addressing health concerns and birth outcomes of pregnancy, with pregnancy and birth due to the long-term and previous exposure to uranium, reproductive health outcomes, adverse birthing experiences, and developmental health of children are areas of focus for this study. This study is also partnered with the University of New Mexico, also known as UNM, Navajo Area Indian Health Services, also known as IHS, as well as the Navajo Nation Department of Health. So this first sub-study is called Exposure to Uranium and Cochlear Males Among Pregnant Navajo Women. So there was two main objectives. The first one was to evaluate maternal urine concentrations of key metals, and specifically with uranium, since that's what we're focusing on. And this was done at enrollment into the program and at time of delivery for mothers. And then the second goal was to compare the National Birth Cohort Study results to the U.S. the U.S. general population. So, recruitment for the study took place over a span of 5 years, between 2013 and 2018, at hospitals associated with IHS and Public Law 638, specifically targeting Navajo women. This primarily took place during their prenatal appointments, and so in order for individuals to be enrolled into the study, 5 criteria requirements had to be met. The first one was to have a clinically confirmed pregnancy. Mothers had to be between the ages of 14 and 45 years old. Participants had to have lived on the Navajo Nation for a minimum of 5 years at any point. They also had to agree to deliver at one of the IHS or Public Law 638 hospitals, and they also had to agree to allow for follow-up evaluations on their baby during their first year of life. So the diagram to the left has information on how they approached their methodologies, which was all modeled based off the Navajo Birth Cohort Study. So based off the previous slide, once enrollment criteria was met, surveys were distributed to participants, and these surveys collected information such as age, employment, education status, smoking and drug use, food and water sources of the participants. Medical records were also retrieved and reviewed by trained staff. Most women were enrolled during their first trimester. However, there was also a handful that were enrolled during their second and third trimesters. At the time of enrollment, urine samples were collected, and only participants during the first and second trimesters were analyzed for concentrations of uranium. And then following that, another urine sample was collected after week 36 of gestation. This was during their third trimester or at time of delivery. These urine samples were then analyzed for the presence and concentrations of heavy metals. However, in this case, we were focused on uranium. And I briefly mentioned this a few seconds ago, but because there are many variables when collecting information and various factors, there were only 196 participants of the 783 who had both samples for analyzation, and that took place during enrollment and at time of delivery. So the table to the right displays results for analysis of uranium within the urine samples of the NBCS participants, and these results revealed uranium exceeded the acceptable U.S. values of women of the similar demographic. Uranium concentration for the NCBS was 2.67 to 2.8 times higher than the U.S. reference population, and this had indicated that there were higher uranium exposure levels for pregnant Navajo women on the Navajo Nation, which could lead to negative birth outcomes. So this second study was called the Environmental Uranium Exposures and Cytokine Profiles among Mother Newborn Baby Pairs from the Navajo Birth Cohort Study. And this study had a goal of determining associations of uranium exposure among Navajo mothers with cytokine profiles of mothers and their babies. The possibility of prenatal exposure to uranium could reveal immune alterations, and this is a concern because of the possibility of negative impacts on maternal and child health, such as inflammation, autoimmunity, or chronic diseases related to immune dysfunction. And recruitment for the study was very similar to the criteria for the previous one, and it's listed below. So once enrolled to the study, both blood and urine samples were collected from mothers at week 36 of gestation or at time of delivery, and at delivery, babies had their samples collected after birth within a time frame of 24 to 36 hours. Cytokine measurements were also taken from blood samples, and uranium and metal concentrations were analyzed from urine samples. Associations were made based on statistical analyses of data collected. So overall, the table to the left depicts results of uranium concentrations from the urine samples, and then the table to the right depicts cytokine results. And these results overall indicated that there were elevated levels of uranium present in mothers. Babies would also have a higher uranium concentration level present. And this overall would lead to the association that there could be changes in birthing outcomes, child development, and long-term health conditions for these babies. Some key takeaways I feel are important are listed. The first is that uranium exposure directly impacted the health of minors. And this is something I learned in the first study, especially with the development of chronic health conditions of these uranium miners were observed throughout the 25 years following uranium mining. The second takeaway is that health concerns still exist in generations following uranium miners who were exposed during the 1940s and 1980s. And the second and third study that I briefly went over supports this. While generations today did not directly work in the mines, it is suspected that there have been chemical and biological changes that stem from previous generations of uranium exposure. Additionally, individuals and families who live near abandoned uranium mines face the long-term health effects of being within proximity of radiation from these abandoned uranium mines. And this is supported by the Navajo Birth Cohort sub-studies done with pregnant women and their offspring. And lastly, addressing health disparities within communities plays a large role in patient care. And I mention this because as future physicians, future medical providers. I feel that with whatever population you're working with, it's important to understand and be aware of environmental and as well as physical, mental, and spiritual factors that may impact patient health. But yeah, that's the end of my presentation, and right here are my references. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great summer.